So, welcome this morning. Glad you're here. Glad you're here whether you are a believer in God or not. You're very welcome, no matter. I'm Richard Howe. I'm provost at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte. We've got a booth out there you'll want to visit, find out about our school. If you're interested in degree, you're interested in audit, or you're interested in anything that we have to offer, please drop by our table and talk to the people manning the table. Southern Evangelical Seminary is always, and always will be, committed to pursuing truth. As we seek to remain steadfast in the truth and equip others to do the same, we must be willing to boldly, humbly, and lovingly ask the hard questions and confront the problem of evil head on. This is an issue that has touched everyone in some way or another, especially over the past few years. Given COVID, natural disasters, war, famine, racism, baldness. Wait a minute, that's not supposed to be there. Who put that one in there? Is a good God logically possible? This is what we're here to debate this morning. Dr. James Sterba teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in ethics and political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. He has published 35 books and over 200 articles. He's past president of the American Philosophical Association Central Division and the North American Society for Social Philosophy, past president of Concerned Philosophers for Peace, and past president of the International Association for Philosophy and Law and Social Philosophy, American section. He's been visiting professor of philosophy at the University of Rochester and at the University of Latvia in the then Soviet Union on a Fulbright Scholarship Award. In 2013, he received a grant from the John Templeton Foundation to bring the yet untapped resources of ethics and political philosophy to bear on the problem of evil. This led to his publication of his book in 2019, Is a Good God Logically Possible? Dr. Brian Huffling is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Theology and Director of the PhD program at Southern Evangelical Seminary. He has taught at the Art Institute of Charlotte, Arbor Brook Christian Academy, and also teaches at Apologia. His BA is from Lee University in history with a minor in Bible. He has an MA in apologetics, philosophy, and biblical studies from Southern Evangelical Seminary. His PhD is in the philosophy of religion from SES. He has served on staff at 4 churches and also served in the Marines and Navy Reserves. He is currently a chaplain in the Air Force Reserves. He is married to Lacey and has 3 children. Dr. Sterba and Dr. Huffling have previously debated this topic right down the road at Winthrop University. And Dr. Sterba has guest lectured in Dr. Huffling's class on the problem of evil, and they have appeared together on the Purple Pill Philosophy podcast. Dr. Sterba served as guest editor for the online journal Religions, in which he responded to 16 contributors, including Dr. Huffling, on the arguments in his book. They are working together on a second round of these articles to be released this fall. If you would give a hearty welcome to Dr. James Sterba and Dr. Brian Huffling. So some of you may already be familiar with these kind of formats, but let me just remind you, if you're already familiar, but tell you for first, if you've never seen one of these, exactly how this will happen. They'll each have a 25-minute opening starting with Dr. Sterba. After which then they'll each get 7 minutes. So Sterba, Huffling in that order. After that then we're going to take about 25 minutes up until the closing around noon of questions and answers from the audience. So I want to encourage you to be thinking of your question, and if possible, perhaps write it down so when you come to the microphone, you can read it and make sure your thoughts are clear. I realize sometimes questions need a little bit of a context, but you'll want to avoid getting into the debate yourself. That's always tempting for people on both sides to want to engage. So make sure you've got a really succinct question to ask. And I will cut you off if you start lobbying there, because this thing might work upside the head. No. In love, of course. So what will happen then when you give your question, if you want to direct it to one of the speakers, that's fine, but each speaker will get 2 minutes to respond to the question no matter who you direct it to, so you don't need to worry about that. So it doesn't matter which microphone you line up. It's not that one's for one speaker, one's for the other. It doesn't matter. If I do my job correctly, I'll volley back and forth to make sure it's fair between the two mics. So you got about a minute to ask your question, and then they'll each respond for 2 minutes. Towards the end then, as we get close to the noon hour, I'll cut off questions in time enough for each speaker, beginning with Dr. Sterba, to give a 5-minute closing. So let us begin with Dr. Sterba.
I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to thank everyone who helped to organize this debate, especially Brian Huffling, who invited me to do it. The question I seek to address in this debate is whether or not an all-good, all-powerful God is logically possible given the degree and amount of moral evil that exists in our world. Now, it is widely held by theists and atheists alike that Alvin Plantinga conclusively showed against John Mackey that it may not be within God's power to bring about a world containing moral good and no moral evil. Mackey stated the problem of evil in its most challenging form as follows. Well, what happens now? Here it goes. Okay, wait. Here we go. God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. But at the same time, all three are central parts of most theological positions. The theologian, it seems, at once must and cannot consistently adhere to all three. Accordingly, the three main propositions of Mackey's argument are: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, evil exists. However, the contradiction between these propositions does not arise immediately. Mackey needed to add something else to the argument in order to explicitly derive a contradiction. The premises Mackey added were: a good God always eliminates evil as far as he can, and 5, there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Now, if these additional premises had been true, or necessarily true, a contradiction would have been derivable. However, as Alvin Plantinga pointed out, neither 4 or 5 is true, let alone necessarily true. To reject 4, Plantinga showed that even for beings like ourselves, who are good, we do not always eliminate evil as far as we can, especially when not doing so would lead to a greater good. And that contradicts premise 4. To reject 5, Plantinga had to assume that determinism was false, but given that assumption, he was able to show that it may not be within God's power to bring about a world containing moral good, but no moral evil, thus contradicting premise 5. In this way, Plantinga was able to show that Mackey failed to provide the premises that were needed to make his argument work. As it turned out, Plantinga's overturning of Mackey's argument was a pivotal event in the contemporary discussion of the problem of evil. When Mackey failed to derive a contradiction by joining together 4 and 5 with the assumption that an all-good, all-powerful God of traditional theism exists, and the generally acceptable empirical premise that evil exists, without which there would be no problem of evil, it was not as if philosophers working on the problem of evil at that time or since, who wanted to support atheism, had other suitable, necessary, normative, or metaphysical premises waiting in the wings, ready to deploy. After Mackey lost his debate with Plantinga, it was not clear how anyone inclined to defend atheism could continue to approach the problem of evil as Mackey had done. This helps explain why philosophers who still wanted to defend atheism turned their attention to a new strategy, that of developing what came to be called evidential arguments for atheism. All this meant was atheists were no longer trying, as Mackey had, to add necessary premises to their arguments in support of atheism. A consensus had formed that logical formulations of the problem of evil were untenable. After the defeat of Mackey's argument, while atheists were able to come up with arguments from all the evil in the world, they were seemingly forced to admit that there might be goods, or at least presently unknown to us, that could serve to justify God's permission of all the horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions in the world. Thus, buoyed up by the defeat of Mackey's argument, theists were hopeful that a free will defense would be able to provide a justification for God's permission of all the evil in the world. Unfortunately for theists, atheists were able to turn the theist freedom argument against them by showing that arguably the best way to promote significant freedom in the world would have been for God, like a just political state, to prevent rather than permit horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions in the world as needed. The upshot was that if theism was to be justified, it had to be in terms of some other good or goods than the distribution of freedom in the world, a justification that theists had yet to provide. Atheists also were clearly limited by their seeming inability after the failure of Mackey's argument to come up with necessary normative or metaphysical principles to use in their arguments against theism. Yet that was not how I viewed the debate over the problem of evil when I turned my full attention to it in 2013. At the time, I had published my last book in ethics and political philosophy with Oxford, and I was wondering what I should do next. Having spent virtually all of my career at Notre Dame in the shadow of its Philosophy of Religion Center, it was impossible for me to be unaware of the many discussions of the problem of evil that had taken place there over the years. One thing I had noticed is that most philosophers of religion involved in these discussions were metaphysicians or epistemologists by training, and so tend to be less knowledgeable of what resources moral and political philosophy might bring to the problem of evil. That led me to come up with the idea of bringing untapped resources from ethics and political philosophy to bear on the problem of evil, and I put it into a proposal to the Templeton Foundation. Since Sir John Templeton thought science was progressive and religion moribund, he believed that bringing the two together would be good for religion. Accordingly, I presented my project to the Templeton people as bringing the science of ethics to bear on philosophy of religion, specifically the problem of evil, and they bought it and gave me money to run 2 conferences on the topic and to take a year off to research the topic myself. Now, in my initial work on the problem of evil, I found it particularly surprising that while most theists working on the problem are self-identified Christian philosophers, a central underlying element of Christian ethics called the Pauline principle, never to do evil that good may come of it, Romans chapter 3, verse 8, had been virtually ignored despite its apparent relevance to the problem of evil. Hence, when I invited some of the most well-known philosophers of religion in the English-speaking world to come to Notre Dame to address whether there are yet untapped resources in ethics that could be employed for the more adequate solution of the problem of evil, I asked them in particular to address the relevance of the Pauline principle, never to do evil that good may come of it. At the time, my expectation was that one or another of my speakers would appeal to something that Thomas Aquinas said about this in the Middle Ages, or appeal to something that Immanuel Kant said about it during the Enlightenment, which completely explained the puzzle that I, the newcomer to the problem of evil, was having with reconciling the Pauline principle's prohibition on doing or permitting especially horrendous evil to achieve some good with a theistic solution to the problem of evil. Accordingly, what happened at these conferences totally surprised me. Rather than trying to show how a theistic solution to the problem of evil is completely compatible with the requirements of the Pauline principle, most of my conference speakers tried to avoid addressing the problem altogether. They did this to such an extent that in the conclusion of the published collection of papers from these 2 conferences, I was forced to admit that while the conference papers had made some advances, concerning how to bring resources of moral and political philosophy to bear on the problem of evil, by and large, they had still failed to come to terms with how the Pauline principle related to the problem of evil. I kept working on what I call my God project in the years following the Templeton-sponsored conferences, writing papers that would become chapters in a book manuscript, presenting those papers and getting feedback that allowed me to move along until late in 2019, I published Is a Good God Logically Possible?, in which I argued that the all-good, all-powerful God of traditional theism is logically incompatible with all the evil in the world. The way my argument works is that I was eventually able to carve off from the Pauline principle three exceptionless minimal components of what are necessary normative requirements. These requirements could then function in a Mackey-style logical argument against the existence of God. It is also important that I was able to deploy a fourfold category scheme from political philosophy that enabled me to talk about all the goods that God could possibly provide to us. So what is my argument? It begins by specifying three evil prevention requirements. These requirements are exceptionless, minimal components of the Pauline principle, which are the counterpart in my argument to the failed necessary normative and metaphysical principles in Mackey's argument. These requirements, in turn, range over all the goods with which God could provide us, which are either goods to which we have a right or goods to which we do not have a right. Each of which, in turn, further divides into goods that are logically dependent on God's permission of especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions, or goods that are not logically dependent on God's permission of especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral action. Here are the three evil prevention requirements that apply to this fourfold classification of all the goods with which God could provide us. Evil prevention requirement 1, prevent rather than permit especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions without violating anyone's rights, a good to which we have a right, when that could be easily done. Now, we are sometimes stuck in a situation where we can provide only some people with a good to which they have a right, and hence prevent a corresponding evil from being inflicted on them, by not providing other people with another good whose non-provision inflicts a lesser evil on them. For example, we may only be able to save 5 people from being robbed and assaulted if we don't try to also save 2 other people from being robbed and assaulted who are further off. God, however, would never find himself causally stuck in such situations. God would always have the causal power to prevent both evils. Accordingly, God would have to prevent both evil consequences in all such contexts as needed, unless there is a good, the provision of which would justify God in permitting the lesser evil in such cases. Evil prevention requirement 2, do not permit rather than prevent especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions in order to provide their beneficiaries with goods they would morally prefer not to have. With respect to goods such as receiving medical care after being brutally assaulted, to which victims have a right, of course, it would be wrong not to provide such goods when one can easily do so without violating anyone's rights. However, given the need we have for such goods depends on the existence of significant moral wrongdoing, it would be morally preferable for anyone who could do so to prevent the consequences of that wrongdoing on which the good depends. This is because the victims of significant moral wrongdoing who would have a right to such goods would have morally preferred that anyone who could have easily done so would have kept them from suffering the consequences of the wrongdoing that would ground their rights to any goods of rectification and compensation. For example, a victim of brutal assault would have morally preferred that anyone who could easily have done so would have prevented their assault to their now having rights to goods resulting from that assault. Moral evil prevention requirement 3, do not permit rather than prevent especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral action which would violate someone's rights to provide goods to which beneficiaries do not have a right when there are countless unobjectionable ways of providing those goods. With respect to goods to which we do not have a right, that do not depend on wrongdoing, such as the offer of friendship, others would have numerous ways of providing us with such goods without violating our rights. In cases where we humans are causally constrained and are thus unable to provide someone with such a good without permitting the serious violation of the person's rights, God would never be subject to such causal constraints. Now, the only logically possible reason anyone could have for not abiding by these exceptionalist minimal components or requirements of the Pauline principle is either that one is grossly unreasonable or one is causally or logically incapable of doing so. Accordingly, in the case of God, if he exists, his widespread failure to act in accord with these requirements would either make him grossly unreasonable, which is logically impossible, or make him logically incapable of acting in accord with these requirements, which with the result that God would be much less powerful than we are, which also is logically impossible. Hence, the God of traditional theism is logically incompatible with especially the horrendous evil consequences of immoral action that exist in our world. We could also restate my argument to approximate the form that Mackey should have used to succeed in his famous exchange with Plantinga as follows. 1, there is an all-good, all-powerful God. This is assumed for the sake of argument by both Mackey and Plantinga. 2, if there is an all-good, all-powerful God, then necessarily he would be adhering to evil prevention requirements 1 through 3. 3, if God were adhering to evil prevention requirements 1 through 3, then necessarily horrendous evil consequences of immoral action would not be obtaining through what would have to be his permission. 4, horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions do obtain all around us, which if God exists would have to be through his permission. This is assumed by both Mackey and Plantinga. 5, therefore it's not the case that there is an all-good, all-powerful God. Now, debate over the success of my argument has been ongoing at least since the publication of my book in 2019. Recently, it's gotten more intense. Last year, a special issue of the journal Religions was published on my book. In that special issue, 16 philosophers, including Brian, contributed critiques of my God argument, and I responded to all of them in that same issue. Last year as well, my God argument was debated at an online forum at Princeton University. In the question period, Andrew Shagnell, who invited me to participate in this debate, raised an objection that I thought I had successfully answered. Just about 2 weeks later, when Shagnell and I had a chance to engage in a follow-up Zoom discussion, Shagnell again raised the same objection, this time in a more developed form. And again, I thought I had adequately answered it, but this time I was a little less sure about my answer. I kept thinking about Shagnell's objection for the next few days, and eventually had to admit that the objection worked. Shagnell argued that when God permits horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions to be inflicted on innocent victims, it's possible that those victims, maybe not in this life, but in the next, would have opposing moral preferences to those assumed by evil prevention requirement 2. Why did Shagnell think that was possible? Well, first, he expanded the assumptions that theists were employing in their argument. In addition to the assumption that God is all good and all powerful and that there is an afterlife, Shagnell added the assumption of the incarnation, resurrection, and glorification of Christ as both God and man. That's a lot to ask an atheist to assume and still argue that the God of traditional theism is logically incompatible with all the evil in the world. But I gave Shagnell his additional assumption and considered what follows. Shagnell used this new assumption to claim that anyone who suffers horrendous evil in this life could experience a deep sharing with the resurrected and glorified Christ in the next life, given that they both had suffered horrendous evil in this life. This is a deep sharing that those who have not suffered horrendous evil consequences in this life would lack, even if they enjoyed a heavenly afterlife. Accordingly, those who suffered horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions in this life may be said to morally accept, at least in the next life, God's permission of that suffering being imposed on them, because they now recognize how it makes possible a deep sharing with the resurrected and glorified Christ, who likewise suffered from horrendous evil. For further support, Chagnel refers to the religious phenomena of stigmata that seems to have first occurred in Christianity with St. Francis of Assisi in the early 13th century and continued from that time on, after that, mainly in Roman Catholicism. What happened in the case of St. Francis is that about 2 years before his death, wounds appeared in his hands, feet, and side, resembling those that Christ was thought to have experienced at his crucifixion, although never expressed in exactly the same way from stigmatic to stigmatic, and never evaluated by independent authorities. Nevertheless, the relevant point here is that stigmata, which were thought to be painful reenactments of the suffering of Christ, were generally welcomed by those who experienced them as a way to be closer to Christ. Likewise, Chagnel argued that those who suffered horrendous evil in this life might well, from the perspective of the next life, find morally acceptable God's permission of their suffering, given the deep sharing with Christ, who similarly suffered that their suffering made possible. So does my argument collapse in the face of Chagnel's objection? Once I fully appreciated the force of Chagnel's objection, I thought it did. Chagnel had come up with a possible good that, while not violating my evil prevention requirements, could still seemingly justify God's permission of all the horrendous evil suffering in the world. It took me a few days before I came to realize that this was not the case, because there was a conflicting good whose preferability to Chagnel's proposed good undercuts the objection he raised. But what is this preferable good? Remember, I was allowing Chagnel's additional assumption of incarnation, resurrection, and glorification of Christ as both God and man. Nevertheless, during the earthly ministry of Christ, there was no need for Christ to suffer the infliction of the horrendous evil that was said to be imposed on him. From a theological perspective, any way that Christ could have lived a good life would have sufficed to bring about our redemption. Moreover, if God had prevented the horrendous suffering that was said to be imposed on Christ, as he should have, his life on earth would have been more like that of Nelson Mandela, or Dolores Huerta, or Mohandas Gandhi without his assassination, each of whom in different ways provided a powerful example of how we should live our lives. Accordingly, for those of us whose earthly lives resemble the lives that are now assumed, that we are now assuming that Christ, along with the likes of Mandela, Huerta, and Gandhi, would have been able to live, given that God had prevented as needed all especially horrendous evil suffering in the world, it would be possible for them to experience a deep sharing with Christ, as well as with these other heroes, both now and in any afterlife. Hence, the sharing between Christ and ourselves that would occur in a world where God prevented horrendous consequences of immoral actions as needed, like the solidarity that would be experienced by citizens committed to living in an ideally just and powerful political state, is clearly preferable to the sharing of horrendous suffering between Christ and ourselves that would be made possible by our living in a world where God, if he exists, would be permitting such suffering to be inflicted on wrongdoers, resulting in injustice, very much like injustice we see in our world. Accordingly, I judge that my argument that an all-good, all-powerful God of traditional theism is logically incompatible with all the evil in the world still works as of April 9th, 1046. Thank you.
Good morning. I came to SES in 2004. I remember our first conference, I never would have thought I would be here at our 30th anniversary speaking, so I am humbled to do that, and I thank SES for allowing me to do that. And I want to thank also Jim for coming down. It's a long trip, and I've really enjoyed getting to know Jim over the past couple of years. We've done a lot of work together. It's just been a lot of fun. He's such a nice guy, and makes it fun to go and learn about these issues and study them. So thank you for your friendship. I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you some more. All right. It is important to be clear what this debate is and is not about. First, it is about a philosophical problem about evil and God's existence. It is not meant to address the emotional or pastoral problem of evil. Second, it is not about proving whether God actually exists. It is about whether God could logically exist. This is because Dr. Sterba has taken up the extremely difficult task of arguing not only that God does not exist, but that there is no logical way he could. A further distinction should be made to clarify this debate. There are two forms of the problem of evil: the deductive or logical problem that argues God cannot logically exist with the amount of evil in the world, and the inductive or evidential problem of evil that argues that given the amount of evil there is, God probably doesn't exist. I would say that most atheistic philosophers today prefer the inductive problem since it is easier to maintain, and some, if not most, have recognized there is no formal contradiction between the existence of evil and the existence of God. While we are making our terms clear, I will point out that the God that Jim and I both have in mind is the omni-God of classical theism, who is said to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and in some sense, all-good. Jim has previously recognized that a God who is not all good could possibly exist, but that is not the point of this debate, since we are debating whether a good God could exist. While the problem of evil is arguably the most popular and powerful argument against theism, and is primarily a debate between theists and atheists, part of my critique of this issue is against the way theists go about trying to answer the problem. Typically, both atheists and theists start with the existence of evil and then try to say what God would have to be like before they examine his nature. In other words, the argument starts with evil and tries to see how God fits in. I think this is totally backwards for how theists should examine the problem. This is for two reasons. First, there are good, if not sound, arguments for the existence of God. Some of these arguments attempt to demonstrate that God is a necessary being, that is, a being that must exist. If that is the case, then evil could not be an argument against such a God, even in principle. Second, evil is part of the Judeo-Christian worldview. It is somewhat ironic and even bizarre that atheists want to take an aspect of our worldview to demonstrate our worldview is false, as if the existence of evil takes us by surprise. If it weren't for the existence of evil, and even horrendous evil, there would be no Judeo-Christian worldview, for such religions wouldn't even exist themselves. Such evil is a central tenet of our belief system, so that the existence of such evil is not likely to be an argument against our system. With this said, I and certain other theists believe that we should not start with the question of evil, but the question of God. For if there are sound arguments for God's existence, then evil would not simply overturn such arguments. Again, this debate is not arguing that God exists. In fact, I'm going to take God's existence for granted in this debate, much like Jim takes his non-existence for granted. If nothing else, this should hopefully show that God's existence is at least possible. Such a position is what Brian Davies calls the "we already know God exists" argument. It does not assume that God exists in a way that presuppositionalists do. Rather, it is a position that says we have already examined the arguments for God and believe that God not only exists, but is a necessary being. If such arguments are sound, then again, evil cannot be an argument against God, even in principle. The point is not merely to take a position on the existence of God, but also about his nature. For the atheists who argue in the way that Jim does, take certain positions about God's nature that, if false, would render their arguments invalid. However, before I get into this, I want to make one other logical point that actually comes from a well-known atheist on the problem of evil, William Rowe. Rowe argues that the typical deductive form of evil can be attacked by the theist. Here is one typical form of the deductive argument. God would not allow more evil than necessary. There is more evil than necessary, therefore God does not exist. The way the theist can respond, according to Rowe, is by using what is known as a G.E. Moore's shift. In short, the shift rearranges the argument to say God exists, God would not allow more evil than necessary, therefore there is no unnecessary evil. Rowe's response to his own theistic objections are less than amazing, to say the least, but I'll let Jim respond to that if he wishes. However, I think the G.E. Moore shift here is pretty clever and likely successful. The application for this debate is that Jim wants to argue that God would not allow horrendous evil to occur. In this regard, the term horrendous might be synonymous with unnecessary evil, which would make the G.E. Moore shift applicable. If they aren't synonymous, they may be analogous. So allow me to summarize Jim's argument so that I can be clear in my response. If there is an all-good, all-powerful God, then necessarily he would adhere to the principles that he gave to you. If God were adhering to moral evil prevention requirements, then necessarily significant and especially horrendous evils wouldn't happen. Significant and especially horrendous evils of immoral actions do obtain all around us. Therefore, it is not the case that there is an all-good, all-powerful God. In other words, if an all-good, all-powerful God exists, he would be under a moral obligation to prevent significant and horrendous evil. Such assumes that God is a moral being with moral obligations. If such an assumption is proven false, then the logical problem as just presented fails. Hence, it is going to be my argument in this debate that while God is an infinitely good being, his goodness is not moral in nature in the way that humans are, and that he has no obligations in the way that we do. I am going to argue that God's being transcends the moral order like it transcends the order of space and time. Let me first briefly explain the way I believe God is good. One way of looking at goodness is related to existence or being. For instance, if something has all of the being it is supposed to have, and it is perfect. Since God has all being and is infinite, he is not only good, but perfectly good and infinitely good. An example of lacking being, following Augustine, is when a being has a privation of being or a lack of being or a corruption of being. For example, if someone is blind, he lacks some goodness or perfection that he should have. The same goes for a missing arm. We could even say the same for a person's character or morality. If one is not good in terms of his character, then he lacks goodness that he should have. This is to say he is immoral, but he is supposed to be moral, otherwise the idea of immorality makes no sense. God has no such shortcomings like this, so we can say he is good in the sense of being philosophically or metaphysically perfect. I have noted two aspects of goodness regarding humans and only one with God. The two I have noted for humans are philosophical goodness and moral goodness. The former has to do with being or existence. The latter has to do with behavior. Both have an aspect of dependence, with philosophical goodness being dependent on what a thing is or has, while moral goodness depends on what one does or how he acts. Moral goodness is situated in relation to obligations. Humans have an obligation to perform certain actions and to avoid certain actions. These actions are largely based on the nature of what it means to be human. In other words, some actions promote the goodness of human nature, while others prohibit such goodness. We are considered moral because we have a moral dimension to live up to or fail to live up to. This moral nature is arguably the case for all humans everywhere, and thus in some way transcend individual humans and are just part of the human nature. But in some way, our moral nature is what it is due to our being obligated by our moral requirements. What Jim is arguing is that God has exactly or nearly exactly the same moral requirements as humans. While it is easy to see how humans have such obligations, it is not nearly so obvious with a being who is considered the transcendent creator of everything that exists besides him. We have moral obligations because he has caused those obligations. This is possible because he is our cause, if theism is true. However, theism teaches that God has no such cause and that there is nothing that transcends him. So what could be an obligation for God? It seems that obligations are imposed on finite beings, but nothing imposes on God. Thus, it is arguably the case that since God has no cause and nothing external to him that imposes obligations, that he has no obligations. However, if he has no obligations, then he is not obligated to prevent significant and horrendous evil. And such being the case, it is logically possible that God and significant and horrendous evil coexist. Let me put it another way. Moral obligations are properties of creation. God is not part of creation, therefore God does not have moral obligations. Even if it were demonstrated that God does have something analogous to human morality, which is allowable in classical theism, it does not guarantee that God has moral obligations to prevent horrible evil. In other words, even if we maintain that God in some way is moral or looks like moral compared to humans, that would not be enough to show that he is under some obligation due to that morality to prevent terrible evil. One could only say that God has such an obligation if he is very much like a human being. However, if God exists, he is not like human beings, although it can be said that in an imperfect way, human beings are like God. The relationship is not symmetrical. This would be clear, but unfortunately, it should be clear, but unfortunately, even theists over-anthropomorphize God in this way. Humans are temporal, God is eternal. Humans are changeable, God is not. Humans are physical, God is immaterial. Humans are finite, God is infinite. Humans are contingent, God is necessary. Humans are caused, God is not. Such radical differences should make it clear that we cannot simply assume that God is like humans in terms of his moral obligations. If obligations are properties of creation, then necessarily it is the case that God has no such obligations. Jim's reason for saying that God is moral is because if he existed, then he is a rational being, and all rational beings, according to Jim, are moral beings with obligations. I am arguing that when we predicate something of both creation and God, the term being predicated cannot mean the same thing. Let me first make the case with finite objects. When we predicate the term good to cheeseburgers, computers, shoes, and people, it is fairly obvious that what makes these things good are not the same. Cheeseburgers are good, but not like computers. Shoes are good, but not like people. So I think it is wrong to say that the term good can be used univocally or the same way with these things. So what does it mean for the term for them to be good? These finite things are good if they are what they are supposed to be according to their nature. Cheeseburgers are good if they're tasty and nutritious. Computers are good if they function properly. Shoes are good if they're stylish and comfortable and protective. And people are good physically if they have no physical problems, and good morally if they have good character. So there is a relationship between a thing's goodness and its nature. What it means for one thing to be good is not what it means for another thing to be good. The thing referred to has its own meaning of goodness. However, they are all good in that they have a relationship, that's why it's an analogy, between goodness and what they are supposed to be. Notice that the meaning of goodness differs radically even between finite, temporal, created things in our normal daily lives. If the notion of goodness differs so much between our cheeseburgers and our shoes, then how much more does the meaning of goodness differ between man and God? But good is not the only term this applies to. It also applies to terms like rational. Human beings are rational because they think and reason, but we think and reason discursively, that is, in time and in a temporal sequence or before and after. If God is an eternal being that is outside of time, then he does not reason in such a way. Thus, our reasoning processes are different. It is not wrong to say that God is rational any more than it is wrong to say he is good or exists, but it is wrong to think that God is rational in the exact same way as human beings are. If we think of terms like good and rational apply to God and man in the same way, then we make God more like a man and less like God. Remember that Jim asserts that God's moral obligation is due to him being a rational being. The argument would work like this: all rational beings are moral. God is a rational being, therefore God is moral. This logic seems valid at first blush. However, I think it might suffer from the fallacy of equivocation. For the logic to be valid, the term rational has to have the same meaning in both premises. I submit that it might not. In a response to an article that he invited me to write, he says that if we take my argument for moral properties and replace the term moral with intelligent, it would show that God can have properties that are similar or alike with creatures. However, again, I disagree. While I do take the term intelligent to be applicable to God, it is not applicable in the same way as it is applied to humans. In other words, it is analogical, but not univocal. What does this mean? When we talk about humans being intelligent, we usually just mean smart or knowledgeable. Is God smart? Well, on the classical view of God, God does not learn things like humans do. He does not think in successive moments like humans do. And his knowledge is not dependent or on external things like it is for humans. He is not passive in terms of knowledge. Rather, God both knows and causes all things by virtue of being a necessary being and pure active existence. As such, there is nothing passive in God whatsoever. Being such a unique being, there is nothing really exactly the same between his existence and ours. Ours is dependent, changing, temporal, finite, and created. God's is necessary, unchanging, eternal, infinite, and uncreated. To use another example, we could ask, is God wise? Well, we can't say that he is wise just like us because our wisdom comes from experience. But in the classical sense, God doesn't experience things in a passive way like we do. So while Jim wants to use the terms intelligence as a way to demonstrate that we think God has properties like created beings, rather than being a counterexample against my argument, I think it actually strengthens my argument. God is not really intelligent in the way we are. I also would argue that God is not rational in the way that we are. Thus, Jim needs to clarify what he means by God being rational and if he thinks that God is rational in the very same way we are. A reading of his book indicates that he does. For example, in one section he says, while the arguments here ranges over God and ourselves, it can be generalized to range over God and all other rational moral agents. By saying God and all other rational moral agents, it at least appears that Jim thinks that God is in the class of rational and moral beings. If that is right, then Jim doesn't seem to think there is a difference between God and other beings with these properties. But this is exactly what I am arguing against. And not just against Jim, but against many theists who put God in the same class of things. As others, such as Brian Davies, has said, God is not just a being among other beings. The main difference between Jim and me is that we have radically different conceptions of what we mean by God. Interestingly and ironically, this is a battle we at SES have had with many other thinkers, most of them theists. I believe, as do other theists, including my colleagues at SES, that a major problem that theists and atheists have is that they talk about God as if he is a being among other beings and use terms in the exact same way in relation to creatures and the Creator. This issue is clearly seen not just in the debate about God and evil, but also about the divine attributes, how God relates to time, change, creation, etc. It is probably the most important issue we in philosophical theology can discuss and needs correction with both theists and atheists. Having said all that, when Jim argues that God has moral obligations simply in virtue of the fact that he is a rational being, it needs to be clear what Jim means by rational. If he means simply rational like other humans, then I do not think that point can be made, since God simply is not a human being. Again, being obligated or being moral is dependent on the being in question behaving properly or living up to a standard that has been imposed on it. While Jim and I both agree that human ethics and moral obligations are objective, I hold that the objectivity of morality is found in the human nature as God created it. In other words, there is an objective human nature we all share as humans, and God has instilled a moral code within us. But not only the moral code, but the very nature itself, humanity, must rely on an objective cause to be what it is. In other words, the reason we have a moral aspect to our nature is because of how God programmed us. But it does not follow that just because the thing programmed has a programmer, that the programmer has a programmer. This is tantamount to saying that just because effects have a cause, then the cause requires a cause. That would only be the case if the cause was contingent, but if God is necessary, then he can't have a cause. Thus, if God has no external obligations being imposed on him, it is not clear how he could have obligations simply by virtue of being rational. Let me give an illustration of what I'm trying to say with the biblical example, Job. God asked Satan if he had considered Job, that he was upright and blameless. Satan asked God if Job had feared God for no reason. If God were to stretch out his hand against Job, then he would curse God. God dared Satan to attack everything Job had, except for his own person. Job's cattle died, his servants died, his 10 children died. God later told Satan that Job still held fast to his faith, even though God said, "You incited me against him to destroy him without reason." God allowed Satan to attack Job's body and cover it with sores. His wife said to him, "Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God and not evil also?" So theists and atheists, would you call what befell Job horrendous evil? He lost 10 children all at once. I would certainly call this horrendous evil. Was God obligated to prevent such evil? If he were, then he failed. If you're going to believe the Bible, then you are going to have to maintain that either God failed to uphold his obligations or that he has no obligations in the manner in which Jim says he does. The rest of the book recounts Job's back and forth with his friends and with God. His friends ultimately believed that God would not allow a righteous person to suffer without cause. Job maintains his innocence and wants to present himself to God to present his case. Job seemed to think that God would not allow evil to befall a righteous person, as if God had to maintain some notion of morality to let things happen. After all, the evil experiences Job had, what does God say when he shows up? Does he offer a theodicy or a defense? No, he says, "I'm God and you are not." Let me add one more aspect to this debate. It can be argued that evil actually proves good and also God. Given the Augustinian notion of evil, it is not a thing in itself, and it must exist in a substance. In other words, in order for evil to exist, a thing has to exist. In this tradition, existence is a perfection. So evil then requires the perfection of being. Since the finite requires another cause that can't go on forever, there must be an ultimate, namely God. In conclusion, Jim has taken it upon himself to strengthen the deductive problem of evil by arguing not only that God doesn't exist, but that there is no logically possible way that he can. In order for Jim's position to be successful, at least the following have to be the case. First, all of the theistic arguments used to show God's existence fail. Not only this, but it would have to be the case that none could ever be successful. Second, it would seem to me that all the terms used between creatures and God would have to be used univocally or in the same way. Third, it would have to be the case that God has the same obligations as humans, which seems hard to maintain, given that he is not a creature with creaturely properties. Fourth, all theodicies and offenses would have to fail. And fifth, and this is probably the most difficult aspect of Jim's position for him to maintain, in order for him to say that there is no logical way for God to exist, Jim must maintain that his position cannot possibly be wrong. From a philosophical and even human point of view, such a position seems impossible. I argue that a finite human being can simply not say there is no logically possible way that a theory could have zero problems, especially given the nature of this theory and the length and study of the debate on God's existence. Thank you.
Now, Brian concedes that my argument works against the existence of the God of traditional theism, but not against the God of classical theism. What distinguishes the God of classical theism from the God of traditional theism is that the God of traditional theism is understood to be morally good, whereas the God of classical theism is understood to be good, but not morally good. However, my evil prevention requirements, as I have formulated them here, apply to both the God of traditional theism and to the God of classical theism. Hence, by my argument, both the God of traditional theism and the God of classical theism would be in violation of them, and hence logically incompatible with all the evil in the world. Nor can the defenders of classical theism maintain that their God, if he exists, is not subject to these requirements. To see why this is the case, consider what would have to be God's relationship to other analogous requirements or truths, such as those found in mathematics or logic. For example, consider the law of identity in logic, or the arithmetic truth that 2 + 2 = 4. What would have to be God's relationship to them? Wouldn't God, like ourselves, just know them to be true? Surely it doesn't make sense to ask who makes the law of identity or 2 + 2 to be true. Similarly, it doesn't seem to make sense to ask who makes the requirement, don't torture infants for the fun of it, true, or who causes it to be true. Rather, each of these claims is properly said to be justified by appeal to the ultimate axioms or requirements of the domain to which they belong. Thus, torturing infants for the fun of it is wrong because it is a clear violation of the most basic normative requirement, which is to treat all relevant interests fairly. Now, I don't think this means that those to whom these axioms or requirements apply are dependent on them, but it does mean that they are subject to them and can't justifiably reject them. Recall how Plantinga dismissed one of the premises of Mackey's argument, arguing that it may not be within God's power to bring about a world containing moral good, but no moral evil. Here, Plantinga is claiming that God, whether traditional or classical, is also subject to logical constraints, which even God, traditional or classical, if he exists, can't violate. So it is for my evil prevention requirements. Now, that is my main response to Brian's defense of classical theism. However, Brian does offer up some other defenses of classical theism. For example, he gives the following argument. First premise, if God is the creator of the universe, then he does not have the property of creation. Second premise, morality is a property of creation. Conclusion, therefore God does not have moral properties. He is not a moral being. To evaluate Brian's argument, let's keep the first premise and substitute the second. For the second, intelligence is a property of a creation. Now, Brian does not want to draw the conclusion that God does not have the property of intelligence, that he's not an intelligent being. In fact, elsewhere, Brian affirms that intelligence is an analogical property possessed by both God and ourselves. In addition, he affirms that God is rich in mercy toward us, that he loves us, and that he is virtuous, all which are to be understood to be analogical properties possessed by both God and ourselves. But why can't being morally good also be understood to be an analogical property that is possessed by God and ourselves? Brian provides no reason to distinguish this property from the other properties that he thinks are analogical properties possessed by both God and ourselves. One property that Brian is most concerned to deny that it is possessed by God, if he exists, is that of having or being subject to obligations. Now, we can greatly simplify the use of analogy at work here by replacing talk of obligations altogether with talk of what it would be good for a rational agent, such as God, to do and bad for him not to do. We can also do the same with talk of moral goodness, replacing it with talk of what is good overall with respect to rational agents' actions and their effects on others. Surely these greatly simplified uses of analogy would apply to God, whether traditional or classical, if the other uses of analogy that Brian accepts succeed in doing so. Now, Brian also wants to maintain that God is rational, but not in exactly the way we are rational. I think that's fine. That's an analogical use of the notion of rationality. And analogy is all through our language. When we talk about the planets being like, they're orbiting around, the atom being like the planets orbiting around the sun. That's an analogy. Science has got analogy all through it. Our language has analogy all through it, and it makes true claims. So speaking analogically, you're making true claims, you're just making them by analogy. Now, all we're talking about here is saying morally goodness. That God is morally good is also another analogy. Talk about God is rational, that's an analogy. Talk about moral goodness, that's an analogy. And just one thing about the book of Job. The book of Job is a very interesting book. It looks like it's not all a defense of theism. I think that last, when God tells Job, I'm the creator, and so why are you complaining about anything? I can imagine children coming to their parents who've been abused and treated badly, and the parents say, what are you complaining about? We brought you into the world. That's it. That wouldn't work. It shouldn't work for parents. It shouldn't work for God.
Thanks, Jim. Okay. So I don't think that Jim and I are using the word, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe we can get clarification later on the word analogy. I don't think that we are using that term in the same way. To be kind of ironic, we're using the word analogy in different ways. So when I use the word analogy for God having a property, but like property X, like intelligence or rational, for example, he gives the analogy of parents and children. I think there's some ways in which we can use the analogy of parents and children and then us and God, but we have to recognize that parents and children are of the same order, and humans and God are not of the same order. Now, when it comes to why can't God have moral kind of analogical property, I think he can. I've mentioned this in my opening statement. Let me give you an example of one way that we think that God can be, in a sense, moral, not in the same way that we are. That's what we mean by analogy. So, can God have moral virtues? In an analogical sense, sometimes, let's take justice. We usually think that a person is just when he gives what is owed to someone. Aristotle and others make a distinction between two kinds of justice, commutative and distributive. Commutative is when one gives in relation to some debt. This is not how God is just. God doesn't owe anybody anything. However, there is a sense in which God can be said to be just in the other way, namely distributive justice. However, it does not seem that this really is the moral sense of justice that humans have. Not in the same way anyway. For example, it can be said that God is just in the sense that he gives to his creatures what they deserve. He does not owe a debt to them, and therefore he created them. Before he created them, there would be no one to owe the debt to. However, a distinction that goes back to Aristotle and is relevant here is the distinction between absolute and suppositional necessity. God did not have to create, so there is no absolute necessity there. However, if he did create, then supposing he did, suppositional necessity, he did so necessarily in that regard, supposing he did, just like if you're sitting, you are necessarily sitting. You don't have to sit, but you are sitting. Okay. So supposing God willed to create humans with the physical nature that we have, then he also willed to give humans the kinds of bodies fitting for what makes them to be human, a head, arms, legs, etc. This isn't really a debt that God has. This is simply the way in which God decided to create. He willed to create in a certain way, thus he gives humans what humans need in order to be humans. Thus God is said to be just in giving them what they are due, but this justice is related to God's will, not any kind of divine morality. Aquinas says, thus also God exercises justice when he gives to each thing what is due to it by its nature and condition. This debt, however, is not derived from the former, since what is due to each thing is due to it as ordered to it according to the divine wisdom. And although God, in a way, pays each thing its due, yet he himself is not the debtor, since he is not directed to other things, but rather other things to him. Justice, therefore, in God is sometimes spoken of as the fitting accompaniment of his goodness, sometimes the reward of merit. This kind of justice, though, does not seem to be based in morality in the way that we seem to think of it, as a dependence or any kind of obligation, but in God's will and creative acts. In other words, there is no moral obligation here. So in what sense is it moral? By analogy. In the sense that we know justice from our experience with other beings. God is said to be just because he acts in ways we say a just person acts. Likewise, although more metaphorically, the Bible says that God is angry, not because he's literally angry, which would require God to be passive, changing, and temporal, but because his effects resemble the way in which angry people act, by punishment and destruction. But justice is only analogous to human justice. God's justice is only analogous to human justice, and only for certain kinds of justice. Not all kinds apply to God, such as God being in debtor relationship. Justice then is not exactly like human's justice. It is analogical. All of our predicates of God are analogical, since we do not have direct awareness of the divine essence. This is the heart of the problem when talking about the problem of evil. We treat God like a human being. So I think the parent analogy does work in some cases. I think it's just we need to make sure that we don't outstep the bounds of what's allowed there, because parents and children are of the same kind and class of beings. But I think in this argument with evil, we tend to bring God into the class of beings that we are, and then say, well, God isn't acting like us, therefore that kind of being wouldn't exist. But if we don't assume that God is just like us and the kind of being that we are, then that kind of argument, I think, fails. I do think it's interesting that Jim brought up the objection about the afterlife and Christ paying for us to live with him and to be with him forever. There is an aspect of that, I think, that is good for this discussion, is that this is not the only life, that God has promised us with more to come and to be able to live with him. As Mackey maintained, as Jim said, Mackey realizes in his works that given this logical progression in the argument, unless you make certain assumptions, the logical argument simply does not work. And I think that if we take these assumptions out, like Mackey says, the argument falls apart. And one way to do that is to take out the notion of goodness, that God is all-powerful and good in the way that we are. We're not denying that God is good, of course. He's even good in a better way than we are. He's just not good in a dependent way that requires him to act in certain ways. If we take that out of our argument and our assumptions, and I think this logical problem fails. Okay, I'm done.
All right, thanks, gentlemen, for that. They make my job very easy because they're impeccable in their timing, because they've done this before. So now we want to move into the Q&A section. So I will invite anyone that would like to go to either microphone, and then I will just try to remember to volley back and forth as we go. I'm going to cut us off maybe about 11, 12 minutes before the top of the hour to give us time to have our 10-minute, 5 minutes each closing, with Dr. Sterba going first. So let's take the first question here succinctly and clearly. Go for it.
My question for the gentleman is, how does the question of is a good God logically possible affect the concept of an eternal hell, both scripturally and as society has chosen to define it? Thank you.
just stay at your tables to answer, gentlemen, and just go ahead, and then we'll each get the 2 minutes to go.
Well, I actually wrote a paper that was actually going to be a chapter to my book, and it was about how to fix the problem of hell up for Christians. And I basically said there is a kind of hell or afterlife that would be acceptable. It would be acceptable that in that afterlife that God prevented horrendous evil suffering, and people were still free to do minor infractions, and Hitler would be there trying to do evil, but he never could kind of pull it off because God would be always preventing him, and maybe give up on it sometimes and maybe turn around. That was the afterlife that would be consistent. The whole idea of an eternal hell, it seems like that's just too much. This would be a hell afterlife that would be acceptable for Christianity. But of course, that's the thing that I say God should be doing in this life. So although it looked like a suggestion for Christianity, it turned out when you think about, well, if God should do this in the afterlife, why doesn't he do it in this life? And then you got a big problem.
Well, thanks for the easy questions of getting out of the way right at the front. The question of hell is an interesting and difficult question even for theists. And I want to reiterate again, I'm not talking about the emotional answers to these problems. But I don't see a logical problem with God existing and even being good in the various ways we've been describing it, and the evil or hell existing. We are judged by, in Christianity, we hold that there's original sin, and we're also judged by what we do. And ultimately, we're judged by our unbelief. And so when God says you're going to hell, at least in the Christian tradition that I'm in, we believe that God is, as I was just mentioning, just, and that he's giving us what we do because we have sinned against him. We can't divorce the notion of sin from the discussion of hell and God. The question is how is it that hell seems to be a good answer forever, an infinite punishment? And the answer usually is because there's been an infinite God that's been offended. But we have to be able to take this in the context of our sin and our open rebellion against God. I hope that's a satisfying answer.
All right.
Earlier it was stated by one of you that Gandhi and Mandela as good. You used them actually as definitions of how they should have acted, more like these men. But two of those men out of the three that you were speaking of, those two specifically abused their wives and were known to be wife abusers. And one was sexually promiscuous. So I would ask, what is your actual definition of good? Because if that is your definition of good, then that's not the God that we refer to.
That's good. There are imperfections in our moral heroes in this life. We can talk about Martin Luther King and his imperfections. But we do also recognize them as moral heroes in certain ways that they acted in the world. And what I was saying is that if Christ had kind of lived a life without this horrendous evil, he would have to deal with significant evils. We would all be dealing with significant evils, and there would be a morality to that, and we'd be struggling with that. And we could be in this struggle together. Now, some of us will still be bad in different ways, but we would have this camaraderie with Christ in this life. We didn't need his horrendous crucifixion. Redemption could be possible because Christ was an infinite as God. Anything he did was infinite worth. The crucifixion wasn't necessary. We could be like the natural heroes we have, and Christ would be another one of them.
Yeah, I think your question raises the issue of, what does it mean to be good for a human being? Okay, and Jim and I think both agree that human morality is objective. I think we both agree on that, right, Jim? You think human morality ethics is objective. Human morality is objective for all of us, yes. So I think we agree on that point. But it also highlights the fact that, as C.S. Lewis would say, we know what the moral law is. I'm not sure how you count your ethical system. And we also know that we're not keeping it. And so your question, I think, raises, what does it mean to be good? And then where does that come from? And why aren't we keeping it? And then what does it mean for not keeping it? Am I addressing what you want me to answer?
Partiality, but yeah. Thank you
Okay,
for your
thank you.
time.
In his opening statement, Dr. Sterba said that it was not necessary for Jesus to suffer this horrendous evil. However, he also talked a great deal about these victims of horrendous evil, but he didn't say anything about the perpetrators of horrendous evil. Jesus' horrendous suffering, isn't it necessary for God to be good to also be just? And wasn't the suffering of Jesus not as an example, but as a propitiation for evil? In other words, he didn't suffer evil as an example, he did it to satisfy God's justice. That's my question.
My sense was that since Jesus was also God, anything he did was of infinite value. So he didn't have to die on the cross to redeem us and make up for the offense of, this is very interesting, the offense of humans to God. But God wasn't hurt very much by sin of us. He's a perfect being. The real people that are hurt are all the people who suffered horrendous evil in this life. And you might ask, how is that suffering made up for? What's the compensation to all the people who suffered horrendous evil? In the afterlife, you get friendship with God. But you could get friendship with God without any of this suffering. It's not logically contingent on there being all this suffering. So we have all this suffering that isn't made up for. The suffering to God, well, there isn't any really. That's made up for by Jesus' death, but not the suffering for all those victims throughout all history.
Yeah, there's actually a debate in Christianity about did Jesus have to suffer? And someone point to Hebrews and say there had to be a sacrifice. So logically speaking, or philosophically, some Christians argue that, well, he could have set up where he didn't have to suffer, didn't have to die, but he did. I think this goes back to this distinction between the absolute and suppositional necessity. Well, he didn't have to absolutely die. There was nothing he had to do, but he decided to do that and willed to do that. In doing so, he both atoned for our sin and showed his love for us in that regard, which is a very powerful way. I think it's an interesting aspect of the problem and how Jesus and God try to eliminate and fix the problem. So for the Christian, the problem of evil doesn't stop here. It is solved and resolved in the cross and in the ultimate eternity of where God has planned for his creation to be.
So one thing that's always bothered me about the idea that God should be preventing evil is the consequences it has to just basic cause and effect. Now, I think we can all say, well, it's okay if I try to shoot someone and God keeps the gun from going off. But there's a real butterfly effect here. What if I'm at a restaurant and I spill my water on the floor and the guy comes to clean it up and he moves the bucket somewhere else where it's in someone's way and they trip over it and they break their neck and die? If God is going to intervene and prevent all these possible evils, then it seems we would live in a universe where we can never know even the most immediate consequences to our actions. And that would seem to me to be a universe that would be completely unlivable. And so I don't see how that could be a lesser evil than all these others.
Yeah, that's a very interesting objection. I spent a lot of time working on that. What I ultimately do is to run a scenario where, some horrendous evil happens because, there's two. Horrendous evil happens when we thought God was going to intervene and stop it. And what he does is he does stop the horrendous evil, but he doesn't stop the significant part of the evil. So now we realize, God does intervene. But he intervenes to stop horrendous evil, and he does. If we could intervene and stop both, the horrendous and the significant, we don't. He stops the horrendous and leaves the significant there as our responsibility. And now we kind of know, God is going to be intervening, but only partially. And so we have motivation now, if we're good people, to do all we can to prevent evil, because if we don't, God will prevent the horrendous, but not the significant, and the significant comes back as on our responsibility. Yeah,
God could be selective in what he chooses to prevent from happening, but I think if we interviewed every person on the planet, there would be a lot of horrendous evil. People would say, well, why did God let this happen to me or that happen to me? I remember in the debate that Richard had when I was first at SES, it was a deal with Kruger, was that his name? He had that at Mississippi State, I think it was. And the atheist said, well, if God exists, why don't he just make the lectern levitate? And Richard said, well, at some point, people will just think the lectern will just levitate by nature. If God intervenes all the time and has all these miracles happening all the time, then we wouldn't be able to see the natural course of things, and it would be confusing as to what really is and what isn't natural. So there is a way in which God could intervene. The question is how do we know what that line would be? And then perhaps it's the case that God doesn't allow so much evil to happen that we can't really bear, that he doesn't want. But what's to say that that level, we're still under it, as a Roe, the kind of point that Roe says in his objection to his argument.
Dr. Sterba, in your evil prevention requirements, it seems that you're applying consequentialism to God. And I'm curious if that's true and why you chose that system of ethics for your evil prevention.
There you're wrong. My view is it hits the point of agreement between consequentialist ethics and non-consequentialist ethics. The moral evil prevention requirements are a point of agreement where consequentialist ethics would say don't do this, and non-consequentialist ethics will also say don't do this. I was worried about that. Somebody brought it up. Isn't your argument deontological or consequentialist? And I said, and I even wrote a book about it, an ethics book, which explained. Ethics books usually have a section on God and religion, but they never bring up the problem of evil. And I brought the problem of evil up and showed that it arises under consequentialist ethics and non-consequentialist ethics and can be dealt with at the point where they're in agreement.
Dr. Huffling, any?
Only to say that I think when we start applying human ethics to a non-human, we run into problems. So we take, and people have tried to do this with all kinds of different systems, virtue ethics, deontology, utilitarianism. We can make sense of that in the realm of humanity because we are under moral obligations. But when we start applying a human system of ethics to not even a non-human, but an infinite creator who created humans, the systems don't seem to fit very well, I would argue. Is that, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Dr. Huffling, my question is, if I understand correctly, that you're making the case that God does not have to keep his moral law. How is it not hypocrisy that God does not have to keep his moral law? Wouldn't it be better, so speaking as a necessary being, wouldn't it be better for God to keep his moral law?
Can you clarify what you mean by his moral law? I'm not sure what you're referring to.
So you're saying, so he is the lawgiver, right? But we're making the case that he is still good in not keeping the moral law.
Okay, so the distinction I'm making here, if I understand you correctly, is that God is to put it in terms, the efficient cause of human beings, not the formal cause of humans. So what makes something good or right for a human being is what promotes the goodness of the human nature. So I'm coming from a natural law perspective here. So what I'm saying is that the moral law that God has given us and implanted in us is based in our nature. But God doesn't have that nature. So what's good, morally speaking, for us wouldn't apply to God because remember, we're talking about these different natures, like shoes and cheeseburgers and God and all that. So it's not hypocritical because God is not, I'm not saying God is or has a moral law to follow. I'm saying that God has given us a moral law in virtue of making us human beings having this certain nature we see in Romans 2. Now, is that getting at your?
Yeah, somewhat.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to me, the moral law of morality is like the rules of arithmetic or the rules of logic. God has to, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. Let's get rid of that. He can't throw out the laws of logic. He can't throw out the laws of mathematics. He can't throw out the laws of morality. These are requirements that fall from the axioms of morality, and just as we can't throw out the law, nobody can throw out the laws of mathematics, nobody can throw out the laws of logic. Nobody can throw out the laws of morality.
Okay, thank you.
This is not my question, but as an aside, I did write a paper one time that 2 + 2 does not equal 4.
Did you get it published?
No one listens to me. So in the physical world, been studying physics, in the physical world, there's all kinds of contradictions. The physicists have gotten past your argument. Example, Maxwell proves light's a wave. Einstein comes along, wins the Nobel Prize, proves it's a particle. Well, they can't both be true. They're logically inconsistent. All physicists agree with that. It's a mystery. They got past it 100 years ago. So my question to you, has logic and reason itself been promoted in our Western way of thinking so high that we have been corrupted by it in a sense, in that the physicists accept it's a mystery. You can't have a particle and a wave at the same time. They got past it. Why can't we get past this is a mystery that will never be solved using logic and reason?
This being what? God and evil?
The contradiction that you are saying, that the very debate we've had, is it logically possible? Of course it isn't. Even if I agreed with you, of course it isn't. So what? God's not subject to these laws of logic and reason. It's just like a carpenter uses a hammer or a ruler at their whim. It doesn't even matter. It's a mystery, is the question. So what? It's a mystery.
Or are you going to give that to me first?
I don't care. I'll go first if you want. So I'm not. Where's Hugh? We need Hugh to come up here and answer that question.
I actually gave the example of Plantinga, who's a moral saint in this discussion, and he appeals to the laws of logic. He doesn't think they're a mystery. He uses them in defense of theism. That's common ground. God is going to be obeying the laws of logic. Obeying the laws of logic. That's God. He doesn't go beyond logic.
The physical world doesn't say.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to that. Yeah. Okay. Well, and so your examples from physics, sure, the physics can be unsure. Well, is it a particle? Is it a wave? And eventually, well, maybe it is both. But they knew that it couldn't be a particle in exactly the same way that it's a wave. It was manifesting itself differently in different times, and they were puzzled what to do. And they moved beyond that. That's the factual world. But in back there, they knew that the factual world was also reined in by what's logically possible. And they weren't going to assert contradictions. They might say, it looks like a contradiction, but it can't be. That's what they said. And let's try to work it out. And they did. It was your history.
Yeah, as a non-physicist that I am, I can't explain that. I don't know the physics. But my understanding of it is that, as Jim just said, that they're not contradictory in the same way at the same time. No, I don't think that we're misusing logic, because then we'd be by definition illogical. And I think that logic does, quote unquote, apply to God, because I think Jim's just describing laws of logic and math and morality as kind of Platonic, at least it sounds that way, kind of Platonic eternal objects or whatever. What I would say with logic is that our knowledge of logic and math and morality is that we abstract these things, we come to those things through our experience of reality. Since God is ultimately being, and since logic, like the laws of non-contradiction and so forth, are grounded in being, then we can abstract that God would be logical. Not that he's obeying the laws of logic, but the laws don't exist as things in themselves. We just know them through existence. And since God is existence, then he would also be, quote unquote, logical in that regard. I don't think that works with morality in a sense, but same with math, though. Math would be an abstraction from physical things. Our operations to be able to do math would be abstractions from our physical experience.
Thank you.
This started by taking the Pauline principle and basically building off of it. My question is it possible that the Pauline principle was intended only for humans and not for God? And this would be because we as humans cannot know the consequences of our actions, and as such, we cannot justify committing evil by assuming that a greater good would result. God does not have this limitation because he does know all of the results of any action that he takes. And as such, he could weigh the current evil against all of the future goods and evils that would result from it.
Yeah, I would argue, do you want to go first, or if we're going to say something, Jim?
I don't.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I would agree that the Pauline principle applies to us, but not to God, because that would seem to be a moral principle. Also, as you were alluding to, as other thinkers in the past have said, God is such a sovereign being that evil doesn't escape his providence. He actually uses evil to bring about good, even though that's not just the main reason. He can still do that. And ultimately, good will reign because of God's providence and sovereignty. But I think that the principle as such, as you mentioned, would probably only apply to human beings because we're under those kinds of moral restrictions and obligations, whereas I've been arguing God isn't.
Well, if you take a look at my third moral evil prevention requirement, it says, don't permit horrendous evil to achieve some good when you could get the good in ways, permissible ways that don't involve the evil at all. This sounds like you don't have to know about consequences for that. It's a means-ends thing. You can get the good without going through this horrendous evil. Then don't go through the horrendous evil. That's clear moral requirement. It would apply to any being. Why would you do the evil to get the good when you could get the good without doing the evil? That's all you need to know.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Sterba, your argument incorporates what you call especially horrendous evil. So my question is, can you help me understand what you mean by especially horrendous evil, and what distinction you make with evil that is not especially horrendous, and what standard you're using to make that distinction, or even to call anything evil at all?
Well, I think we know what horrendous evils are. We have perfect good examples of. The Holocaust was a great example of horrendous evil. If anyone wants to deny that one, we're in trouble. So there's a lot of examples of horrendous evils. And the reason I initially had God should be preventing significant and horrendous. And then I thought about this problem of which is called, well, if you got God intervening, then maybe you don't have human motivation to intervene themselves. So then I said, okay, let's just focus on the horrendous. And perfect examples of horrendous. We don't have any problem with that. And then there's significant. We have lots of examples of significant. And this is the stuff that God will not be preventing. He will prevent the horrendous. And, he can prevent the horrendous. I give these arguments why he could prevent the horrendous without, and could get the same good without permitting the horrendous. And that seems to be something objectively wrong to do. Why would you, something clearly understood as horrendous, why would you permit that horrendous when you could get the good that you're trying to get without permitting that horrendous?
Yeah, good question. I think that we talk about the standard of goodness. There's two basic threads in theism, I think, for where that comes from. One has been, and we're trying to navigate the Euthyphro dilemma. What is God say it's good because it's good, or is it good because God is following some standard himself? Some Christians want to say that the standard of goodness is God's nature, and that we reflect that nature. And then natural law theorists like the tradition I follow will say that the standard of goodness is what God has created for us to follow based in our human nature. I would imagine, I think that Jim holds to more of a natural evolutionary scheme that I think would be problematic in saying, okay, well, what does it mean to be a human in terms of having these objectively good moral principles? I think it's easier to see that on a theistic view because God has made us and programmed us to be able to have such goods that promote our well-being. I think it's less easy to see that on a naturalistic scheme.
All right. Well, I apologize to those of you who are in line, but we just got a limited amount of time. However, you might be able to talk one or both of these gentlemen into skipping their lunch and discussing more with you. I'll let them decide whether they want to do that. So we want to move now to our closing for 5 minutes each. We'll begin with Dr. Sterba.
Well, it's hard to figure out how to summarize all of this. I guess the main disagreement the main issue here is between Brian and myself is, is God good, and in what sense is he good? I want to say that he's good, and that he's good in respect to his actions as well as his being. And if you're good with respect to his actions, then you abide by what are objective requirements for good action. And I think just as we have objective requirements for good logic, we have objective requirements for good mathematics, we have objective requirements for good action. And then, so now that's the standard of goodness that I'm going to ask God to abide by. It's understood analogically. We come to this standard, growing up and learning math and learning logic and learning. It's an empirical world we grow up in, but then we create for ourselves, we learn about abstract truths, mathematics, logic, morality, that hold unconditionally. That's our capacity to think. We come to these objective truths and objective requirements. And then we ask could a creator create us? And could he not be subject to any of these these objective requirements? Well, he's subject to logic. He's subject to the laws of mathematics. He should be subject to the laws of action, of good action. And then we look at, let's talk just about the horrendous part, because we might say God could leave us free to test ourselves out, and we want some place for that. But just like parents, if two children are playing, parents watching from the start, and the older boy starts to really beat up on the little kid, in comes the parent, stops them. If there's just a little struggle, the little boy's getting a little worse of it, but he's fighting back, parent stays out. This is a learning experience, fine. But when it moves to a more serious, in comes the intervention. And that it seems like if there is this creator God, and we could give arguments that the world is created. We can give arguments, Big Bang, looks like there could be. But the question is that creator good? Is he good in respect to his actions? And that's why then we can come back and look at our world and talk about where intervention could have been seemingly required from a powerful being and didn't happen. And there's a problem. And the analog here again is I never bring this out, it's in the book more, is the just and powerful state. We would want a state that prevents evil doing in the world. Not just wait for it to happen and punish, but prevent it. And if the state could kind of see it coming, see the guy coming out with the gun ready to shoot, and stop them, they would do it. Now, the reason why we maybe don't want to empower a state like that is because the state could get corrupted and do bad things. But that's not God. He wouldn't be corrupted. He would be the enforcer that never was corrupted. He would just get the evil consequences at the right point and allow us to struggle along and be as good as we can, but without causing horrendous evil consequences. So I guess that's my story.
Well, thank you, Jim, once again for coming down into the lion's den, as it were, to the Christian Conference on Apologetics. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you. And I'd like to thank SES for allowing me, for whatever reason that you may regret now, having me do this in your 30th anniversary of the conference, and Richard for doing the moderation, and for Dr. Habermas for making me nervous, being front and center at the debate. I remember when I had my interview for the PhD program, he was teaching the class, and he was in the lobby, and I just peppered you with questions, probably drove you crazy, and here you are again. So thank you very much. Glad that you're here. So at SES, what we want from our students is not just to know the answers, to parrot them, but to understand the arguments. So what I would say as a professor to my students at this point would be, go get Jim's book. Understand his arguments, know what he's saying, go get the books and articles that I've been referring to, understand those, and come up with your conclusions, and we would try to help navigate those discussions. But we need to be aware of what the atheists are saying and what people against us are saying so that we can understand them enough to be able to respond to them. So I want to encourage you to take the time to do that, and appreciate everyone's patience and working through this debate with us. Let me just reiterate the 5 points that I gave in my conclusion. In order for Jim's position to be maintained, all the theistic arguments that we give as Christians or theists would all have to be wrong. There wouldn't be any possibility of any other ones. The terms that we use between ourselves and the Creator would have to be used in the exact same way, it seems. Third, it would have to be the case that God has the same obligations that we do. Fourth, all theodicies and defenses would have to fail. And then fifth, there would have to be no logical way that someone making the kind of argument Jim is making could be wrong. It seems like a tall order. He has made it difficult to maintain that position, but we do appreciate him bringing his arguments here to us. So one thing I guess I would want to leave you with is go study the issues. Go read the problem of evil. If you haven't read or heard what we're talking about in this regard, then go and do that for yourselves to be able to learn and be aware. And use the problem of evil. This is the Christian Apologetics Conference. Use the problem of evil to be able to share Christ, to be able to share your faith. We all are touched by this problem. It's been a logical problem today, but it's an emotional problem in the real world. So we have to be pastorally careful and sensitive to what people are going through. But we can use people's suffering to help them navigate the waters of life and to share Christ with them. So that would be something else I would encourage you to do, is use the problem of evil and suffering to be able to say how Christ can help them and be there for them and walk with them through life, because that's something that we all suffer with through life, all of us, without any exception at all. But in particular, I think in this discussion of evil, and in God in particular, or across the board, is that we tend to make God like us. We tend to think of God as a being among beings. And I think, as a classical theist in the tradition that I'm in, that we bring God down when we do that. So I would encourage you to think about, when you're saying God is this way or that way, whatever the predicates happen to be, he's X, Y, and Z, am I making him look like me? Or am I making him look like the creator of the universe? So I hope we've given you something to think about today. This has been fun, at least for me. I hope you have had a good time, Jim and all of you out there. But I hope that this is something that can challenge you, so that you can leave and think about and ponder, and then it helps you grow closer to Christ, and that we've given you something to become stronger in your faith, or bring you closer to Christ and use in your own life, with your own family, your own ministry, or whatever the case may be. So once again, thank you for being here, and we really appreciate it.